Fort Huachuca, brothers in arms, strangers at home. September 3rd, 1944, Private First Class William Chino stands on the deck of a troop transport cutting through the Atlantic toward Italy. Around him, hundreds of soldiers from the 92nd Infantry Division prepare equipment, write letters home, try not to think about what's waiting for them across the ocean. Every single one of them is black except William. He's Apache, assigned to this all-black division because some personnel clerk decided non-white was non-white, and that was close enough for the segregated U.S. Army. William doesn't mind. He's spent his whole life being the outsider. What bothers him is the photograph he keeps pulling from his pocket. His grandfather, Sergeant Rowdy, in full Apache Scout uniform from 1886, the year the Apache Wars ended, the year Rowdy started hunting his own people for the U.S. Army. 3 weeks ago, William's father sent a telegram. "Your grandfather died Tuesday. Before he passed, he said to tell you, we fought them, you fight with them, but we're still fighting for the same thing, to prove we belong here." A black sergeant named James Walker notices William staring at the photograph and sits down beside him. "That your grandfather?" William nods. "Apache Scout, served over 50 years. Walker whistles low. "My great-grandfather was a Buffalo soldier, 10th Cavalry, chased Apaches through Arizona in the 80s. The two men look at each other, the weight of history suddenly present between them. Their grandfathers were on opposite sides of a war neither chose. Now they're heading to Italy together, both fighting for a country that considers them second-class citizens." Walker breaks the silence. "You think they'd find it funny or sad that we're here together?" William looks at his grandfather's photograph one more time before putting it away. Both. Definitely both. What William and Walker don't know, what nobody has told them, is that their grandfathers actually knew each other, that in 1886 at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Buffalo soldiers and Apache Scouts lived on the same base, ate in the same mess halls, and created an unlikely brotherhood born from mutual understanding. They were both warriors serving an army that would never fully accept them. This is the story of Fort Huachuca, where America's most marginalized citizens trained to fight for a nation that wouldn't even let them vote, where Apache warriors hunted their own brothers, where black soldiers proved themselves in combat while facing racism at home, where women served despite double discrimination. This is the story of warriors who fought two wars, one against America's enemies and one for recognition within America itself. And this is the story of how their service, their sacrifice, and their courage slowly bent the arc of history toward justice. Let's go back to where this begins. 1866. The United States Congress authorizes 6 all-black military regiments in the aftermath of the Civil War. 4 of these units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 12th and 25th Infantry, will become legendary as the Buffalo Soldiers, earning their name from Native American warriors who respect their courage and fighting spirit. These men are formerly enslaved people and free blacks who see military service as a path to respect, steady pay, and proving their worth in a nation that has just barely acknowledged their humanity. At the same time, in the deserts and mountains of Arizona and New Mexico, the U.S. Army is losing badly against Apache warriors. The Apaches, masters of guerrilla warfare, strike without warning and vanish into terrain they've known for generations. Army units trained for conventional European warfare are completely unprepared. Soldiers die in ambushes they never see coming. Supply lines are cut. Morale collapses. Then someone proposes a solution that seems logical and feels morally wrong. Recruit Apaches to hunt Apaches. In 18s, the same year the Buffalo Soldier regiments form, the Army begins enlisting Apache men as Indian Scouts. The contradictions are immediate and profound. These scouts are asked to hunt their own relatives, their own tribal members, people they grew up with. Some agree because they believe cooperation is the only path to survival. Others need the money. Army Scouts earn more than most Apaches can otherwise. Still others hope that by proving their value, they'll earn respect and a place in the new American society consuming their homeland. Fort Huachuca is established in 1810 in southern Arizona, specifically as a base for operations against the Apaches. The location is strategic, sitting in the Huachuca Mountains, prime Apache territory. From this fort, Army units and their Apache Scouts conduct operations against Apache bands refusing to surrender. Here's where the story gets complicated in ways most history books ignore. At Fort Huachuca in the 1880s, Buffalo Soldiers and Apache Scouts live on the same base. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, those legendary black regiments, are stationed there, chasing Apaches through the desert. The Apache Scouts guide them, track for them, interpret for them. On paper, they're on the same side. In reality, the situation is far more complex. The Buffalo Soldiers understand what it means to be considered less than human by the very nation they serve. Many are former slaves. All face constant discrimination. They prove themselves in battle over and over, yet white officers still doubt them, still treat them as inferior. When they look at the Apache Scouts, they see fellow warriors trapped in an impossible system. The Apache Scouts see the Buffalo Soldiers and recognize something similar. These are men who fight with skill and courage, who are denied the respect they've earned, who serve an institution that barely tolerates them. One recorded incident from 1885 captures this unlikely bond. A patrol of 10th Cavalry soldiers and Apache Scouts got caught in a 3-day desert storm, separated from the main column. They took shelter in a canyon and waited it out together. Years later, a Buffalo Soldier named Isaiah Dorman wrote about that experience in his memoir. We sat in that canyon, black soldiers and Apache Scouts, and we talked. Not much at first, because we didn't have much common language, but by the second day, we were sharing food, sharing stories as best we could, and realizing we had more in common than we had differences. We were all trying to survive in a world that didn't want us. We were all warriors without honor in our own lands. When the storm passed and we found the column again, the white officers looked at us funny. We'd become friends, and that made them uncomfortable. They didn't like thinking that black soldiers and Apache Scouts might have more loyalty to each other than to the Army. By 1886, the Apache Wars end with Geronimo's surrender. The bitter irony is that Apache Scouts play crucial roles in tracking down the last resistors. Sergeant Rowdy, William Chino's grandfather, is one of those scouts. Born in the 1850s, Rowdy grew up free in the Arizona mountains. He learned tracking from his father warfare from his uncles, and survival from the harsh desert itself. When the Army recruited him in 1883, he was 28 years old with a wife and 2 children. He made a choice: resist and likely die, or cooperate and possibly ensure his family's survival. He chose cooperation. For the next 3 years, he tracked Apache warriors he had grown up with. He helped the Army find camps, predict movements, understand Apache tactics. In 1886, he was part of the scout detachment that located Geronimo's final stronghold. The Army officers praised his skill. His own people called him traitor. Both were right. The weight of that choice would follow Rowdy for the rest of his life. After Geronimo's surrender, the Apache Scouts don't disappear. The Army still needs them for various operations as the West continues to be pacified. But their numbers dwindle. By 913, when the 10th Cavalry Regiment, one of the original Buffalo Soldier units, transfers to Fort Huachuca permanently, there are only about 40 Apache Scouts left in the entire Army. The fort becomes a strange meeting place of American military contradictions. Buffalo soldiers, descendants of slaves, now stationed at a fort originally built to suppress Native Americans. Apache Scouts, former enemies, now living alongside the cavalry that once chased them. All of them serving in an army that segregates and discriminates against them. In 1922, the Army consolidates all remaining Indian Scouts to Fort Huachuca. By 1924, recruitment stops entirely. Only 8 Scouts remain, and they will be the last. These men, all Apache, all aging veterans of conflicts most Americans have already forgotten, live in a section of the fort called Apache Flats. Sergeant Rowdy is one of those 8. He's in his 70s now, weathered by decades of desert sun and harder decades of moral complexity. The Army builds proper houses for the Scouts in 1933. Modern structures with electricity and plumbing, a gesture of respect or possibly guilt. But Rowdy and the other Scouts rarely use these facilities. Instead, they erect traditional Apache wickiups near the post cemetery, dome-shaped dwellings made of brush and canvas. They live in the old ways even as the modern world rushes past. They wear Army uniforms for duty, then change into traditional clothing. They draw Army pay, then spend it on their families living on reservations. They are living contradictions, and they know it. Rowdy's grandson, William, visits him during summers in the 1930s. The old man teaches the boy Apache language, tracking skills, stories of a world slipping into memory. But he also makes William understand the complexity of his choices. One evening in 1938, sitting outside his wickiup, Rowdy tells 18-year-old William, "I hunted my own uncle in 1885. Tracked him for 3 days through mountains I'd played in as a child. When the soldiers caught him, they put him in chains. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes that he understood why I'd done it. But that understanding didn't make it hurt less. I served this Army for over 50 years. I've been a good soldier. I've been a terrible Apache. Maybe I've been both at once. I don't know anymore. What I do know is this: you make the choices you can live with, and then you live with them. That's all any warrior can do." Meanwhile, Fort Huachuca is transforming. As World War II approaches, the Army needs massive expansion. Fort Huachuca, with its vast desert training grounds perfect for preparing troops for North Africa, becomes the primary training center for African American soldiers. This is 1941, and the United States Armed Forces are completely segregated by law and regulation. Black soldiers train in separate facilities, eat in separate mess halls, sleep in separate barracks, use separate recreational facilities. They're commanded mostly by white officers, many of whom openly believe their troops are inferior. The contradictions are stunning. America is preparing to fight Nazi Germany's racist ideology while maintaining its own system of racial segregation. By 1940, Fort Huachuca houses up to 45,000 military personnel, with at least about as African American soldiers. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Division, named in honor of the frontier Buffalo soldiers, arrives for training before deployment to Italy. The 93rd Infantry Division trains there before shipping to the Pacific. The legendary 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, those original Buffalo soldier units, are still stationed there, now preparing for mechanized warfare instead of cavalry charges. The base builds separate facilities for black troops. They have their own officers' club, the Mountain View Black Officers Club, because black officers aren't allowed in the White Officers Club. Every aspect of life is segregated. White soldiers and black soldiers live on the same base but in completely different worlds. And in Apache Flats, the 8 aging scouts watch all of this unfold. They see thousands of black soldiers training to fight overseas while facing discrimination at home. They see history repeating itself with different actors. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, what it means to serve a nation that doesn't fully accept you. Then, in December 1942, something unprecedented happens. Approximately 40 African American women arrive at Fort Huachuca as members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, soon to be renamed the Women's Army Corps. These women are pioneers, the first black women to serve in military roles beyond nursing. They come from all over America, volunteers who want to serve their country despite facing both racism and sexism. The Army doesn't quite know what to do with them. They're assigned to communications, administration, motor pools, supply, all the unglamorous work that keeps a massive training base running. Like their male counterparts, they face segregation at every level. They have separate barracks, separate mess facilities, separate everything. They're also paid less than men doing the same jobs. But they serve anyway. They prove themselves capable, professional, essential. Private Essie Johnson from Alabama works in the Communications Center, handling classified messages for the 92nd Division. She writes in her diary in March 1943, "Today, a white officer told me I was doing a fine job, then added that he was surprised to find a colored girl who could handle complex communications work. I wanted to tell him I had a college degree in mathematics and had been working as a teacher before I enlisted. I wanted to tell him his surprise said more about his ignorance than my capabilities. Instead, I thanked him and went back to work." We prove ourselves every single day in 1,000 small ways to people who should never have doubted us in the first place. It's exhausting, but it's also necessary. We're not just doing this job, we're opening doors for every black woman who'll serve after us. That makes the exhaustion worthwhile. The training at Fort Huachuca is brutal. Desert temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees. Soldiers of the 92nd Division endure physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical exercises, all while dealing with the knowledge that many of their white superiors expect them to fail. The division's weekly newspaper, published right there at Fort Huachuca, captures their determination. An editorial from July 1940 reads, "We train harder because we have to prove more. We drill longer because excellence is our only argument. We endure conditions and insults that would break lesser men. And we do it because we refuse to let prejudice become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we ship out to Italy, we will fight with distinction not just for America, but for every black soldier who came before us and every one who will come after. Sergeant James Walker, the soldier who will later meet William Chino on that transport ship, is part of this training. His great-grandfather served in the 10th Cavalry in the 880s, chasing Apaches through Arizona. James grew up on stories of the Buffalo Soldiers, tales of courage and determination passed down through generations. He enlisted in 1942, specifically requesting assignment to the 92nd Division because of its connection to that legacy. In April 1940, James is on a training exercise in the desert when his unit gets lost. They're supposed to navigate back to base using map and compass, but they've gotten turned around in terrain that all looks the same to their urban-trained eyes. They're running low on water, and the Arizona sun is merciless. That's when they encounter one of the Apache Scouts. Sergeant Rowdy, now 83 years old, but still technically on active duty, is out walking the desert, as he does most mornings. He finds these lost soldiers, young black men from cities who are desperately trying to read their map upside down. Rowdy doesn't speak much English anymore, but he understands their situation immediately. He takes their map, orients it correctly, and points them in the right direction. Then, perhaps feeling some obligation to help, he walks with them for an hour, showing them how to read the land, how to find north by sun position, how to conserve water. James Walker, recognizing the scout's uniform insignia, asks in stumbling Spanish, mixed with hand gestures, "Your grandfather, Buffalo Soldier?" Rowdy understands and nods. "10th Cavalry. He chased your people?" Another nod. James thinks about this for a moment, then says, "My great-grandfather. He was in the 10th Cavalry, too. Maybe they knew each other." Rowdy smiles for the first time, showing gaps where teeth used to be. He says in broken English, "They knew. Buffalo Soldiers, Apache Scouts, we knew each other, all warriors, all trying to survive." When they reach a point where the base is visible in the distance, Rowdy stops. He looks at these young black soldiers preparing to fight overseas, and he says something in Apache. James doesn't understand the words, but he understands the tone. It's a blessing or a prayer, or maybe just an acknowledgement, warriors recognizing warriors across generations and circumstances. Rowdy watches them walk toward the base, then turns and disappears into the desert like smoke. In July 1944, as the 92nd Division prepares for deployment, Sergeant Rowdy dies at age 87. He passes quietly in his wickiup, surrounded by the other scouts. Having lived long enough to see his grandson enlist, long enough to see thousands of black soldiers train at the fort, where he spent his final decades, long enough to come to some kind of peace with choices that had haunted him for 60 years. His funeral is held at the Fort Huachuca Cemetery with full military honors. The 7 surviving scouts serve as pallbearers. Officers attend, soldiers attend. But what makes the funeral remarkable is that dozens of black soldiers from the 92nd Division attend as well. They've heard about the old Apache Scout, heard stories about him helping lost soldiers, heard that he represented something important, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. The base chaplain, a white officer, delivers a standard military funeral service. But after he finishes, one of the scouts, Sergeant Sinew Riley, speaks in Apache. Most people don't understand the words, but the emotion is clear. He's saying goodbye to a warrior, acknowledging a life of service and sacrifice and moral complexity. He's saying that Rowdy served honorably in circumstances that offered no honorable options. When he finishes, Sergeant James Walker does something unexpected. He steps forward and says, "My great-grandfather served with Apache Scouts in the 18th. He wrote in his letters about brave men caught in impossible situations. I think he was talking about scouts like Sergeant Rowdy. We're all caught in impossible situations, serving a nation that doesn't fully accept us. But we serve anyway, because that's what warriors do. Sergeant Rowdy understood that. We understand that. And someday, maybe our service will make things better for those who come after." The soldiers fire a 3-volley salute. Taps plays across the desert. The flag draped over Rowdy's coffin is folded and presented to his son, William's father. William Chino, now 24 and weeks away from shipping out with the 92nd Division, receives emergency leave to attend. He stands at attention as his grandfather is lowered into the Arizona earth, buried in the same cemetery as Buffalo soldiers from the frontier days and World War II soldiers who trained at the base. The cemetery is a map of American military contradiction. Apache Scouts buried next to Buffalo soldiers, buried next to white officers, all of them equal in death in ways they never were in life. 3 weeks after the funeral, William ships out. The 92nd Division arrives in Italy in September 1904, immediately thrown into combat in the Apennine Mountains. The fighting is brutal, confused, deadly. German forces hold heavily fortified positions in mountain terrain, eerily similar to the Arizona mountains where William grew up. The division faces challenges beyond enemy fire. They're given inadequate supplies, poor intelligence, and officers who sometimes seem more interested in proving black soldiers can't fight than in winning battles. Some white commanders pull the 92nd out of combat at critical moments, then blame them for lack of progress. It's sabotage disguised as military leadership. But the soldiers of the 92nd fight anyway. They take casualties, they hold ground, they advance when ordered, and defend when necessary. And William Chino finds himself drawing on knowledge passed down from his grandfather. Tracking skills, reading terrain, moving quietly through mountains, skills developed by Apache warriors passed through generations, now employed in Italian mountains against German soldiers. One night in October 1944, William's platoon is pinned down by German machine gun fire from a position they can't locate. The guns are firing from somewhere in the rocks above them, but nobody can spot the exact location. William studies the terrain the way his grandfather taught him to read land. He notices something others miss: a slight discoloration in the rocks, barely visible in the moonlight, suggesting recent disturbance. He tells Sergeant Walker, who has become his closest friend in the unit, and together they plan an approach. They move through the rocks using methods William learned as a child, testing each step before committing weight, moving during sounds that mask their noise, staying in shadows. It takes them 2 hours to travel 200 yards, but they reach the German position undetected. The quick firefight that follows leaves the German gun crew dead and the platoon able to advance. Walker asks William afterward, "Where the hell did you learn to move like that?" William thinks about his grandfather, about summers in Apache Flats, about an old man teaching a boy swirls to pass down through centuries. "My grandfather taught me." He learned from his grandfather. Apache warriors have been moving through mountains like ghosts for longer than this country has existed. Walker nods slowly. My great-grandfather wrote about Apache warriors in his letters, said they were the toughest enemy he ever faced, and he respected them more than he respected most white soldiers he served with. I'm starting to understand what he meant. The two men sit in the dark Italian mountains, a black soldier from Georgia and an Apache from Arizona, both fighting for a country that considers them second-class citizens, both drawing on legacies of warriors who fought against each other generations ago. The contradictions don't disappear, but in this moment, they matter less than the brotherhood forged through shared struggle. Back at Fort Huachuca, the war is winding down. By late 1944 and through 1945, the peak has passed. Divisions have shipped out. The massive training operation is shrinking, but the segregation remains. The separate facilities, the separate worlds, existing on the same base, all of it continues. The 7 surviving Apache Scouts maintain their routines in Apache Flats. They're all in their 70s and 80s now, the last living links to the Indian Wars. They've become living monuments. Officers occasionally bring visitors to meet the last of the Indian Scouts. The Scouts put on their uniforms, pose for photographs, tell sanitized versions of their stories. Then the visitors leave, and the Scouts return to their wickiups, to their memories, to their peace with choices made long ago. Private Essie Johnson continues her work in the Communications Center. In January 1948, she's promoted to corporal, one of the first black women to achieve non-commissioned officer rank. She writes in her diary, "They promoted me today. The white officers made a big show of it, talking about how exceptional I am. But I'm not exceptional. I'm just good at my job. There are dozens of black women on this base who are equally competent, equally professional. The exceptional thing is that the Army is finally, grudgingly, beginning to recognize that. We're not asking for special treatment. We're demanding equal recognition for equal work. That shouldn't be exceptional. It should be normal." World War II ends in August 1940. The 92nd Division returns home in early 1940s. They fought in Italy, suffered casualties, earned decorations, proved themselves in combat. They come home expecting recognition, respect, gratitude. Instead, they find that America hasn't changed. Segregation remains. Discrimination continues. In the South, black veterans are attacked for wearing their uniforms in public. Across the country, they're denied jobs, housing, and basic rights. William Chino returns to Fort Huachuca for processing before discharge. He goes immediately to Apache Flats. There are only 6 scouts now. One more has died while William was overseas. They sit together outside the wickiups, these men separated by generations, but connected by blood, culture, and the common experience of serving an army that never fully accepted them. William tells them about Italy, about using his grandfather's teachings in combat, about his friendship with James Walker. Sergeant Sinew Riley listens, then says in Apache, "Your grandfather would be proud. You survived. You came home. That's all any warrior can hope for. But coming home is sometimes harder than war. You'll find that America doesn't want to acknowledge what you've done. You'll face people who see your skin before they see your service. It will be hard, but you're Apache. We've survived harder things than rejection." James Walker, after processing out of the Army, returns to Georgia. He can't vote in his home state despite being a combat veteran. He can't get a job that matches his skills despite his leadership experience. He faces daily indignities that make his service seem like a cruel joke. But he doesn't give up. Instead, he joins the growing civil rights movement. He attends meetings, organizes voter registration drives, puts his veteran status to use as moral authority. When people tell him to be patient, that change will come slowly, he responds. I fought Nazis in Italy. I'm not going to accept American racism at home. I earned the right to be heard. Essie Johnson returns to Alabama with her Army service record and her corporal stripes. She tries to get a job teaching, but schools won't hire black women with military experience. It makes them seem uppity. She eventually finds work as a seamstress, her mathematics degree and military communications experience wasted. But she refuses to be silent. She writes letters to newspapers, attends church meetings where civil rights strategies are discussed, and becomes a quiet force for change in her community. She writes in 1947, "They want us to forget what we accomplished. They want us to go back to our assigned places and not make trouble. But we've seen what we're capable of. We've proven ourselves in ways that can't be erased. They can deny us jobs and rights and respect, but they can't make us forget what we know about ourselves. And that knowledge is dangerous to the people who want to keep things as they are." In 1947, the Army finally addresses its Apache Scout problem. The last 4 Scouts, survivors of that group of 8 who were at Fort Huachuca in 1924, are retired from active duty. Sergeant Sinew Riley is one of them. They receive pensions, certificates of service, and handshakes from officers who have no idea what these men experienced or sacrificed. They move off Fort Huachuca for the first time in decades. Some go to reservations. Others stay in small towns around southern Arizona. Sinew Riley goes to live with his daughter on the San Carlos Reservation. He's 79 years old, his body worn out from decades of hard service. He dies in 1941, the last of the 8 Scouts. With him dies the formal Apache Scout program that existed for 85 years. The Army makes no official announcement. No monuments are built. These men simply fade from history, remembered only by their families. But something extraordinary happens in 1948 that connects to everything these warriors fought for. President Harry Truman signs Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. It's a direct result of the service and sacrifice of black soldiers in World War II, including those who trained at Fort Huachuca. The Mountain View Black Officers Club, which symbolized segregation, becomes a symbol of resistance and change. The service of the Buffalo Soldiers, from the frontier days through World War II, finally receives the recognition it deserves. Desegregation doesn't happen immediately or easily. It takes years for the order to be fully implemented. Resistance is fierce, especially from Southern officers who see it as an attack on their way of life. But the process is irreversible. The warriors who trained at Fort Huachuca, who proved themselves despite discrimination, who served with honor when honor wasn't extended to them, they made this change possible. Their service became the moral argument that prejudice couldn't answer. William Chino returns to Arizona and works construction for 40 years. He marries, raises 4 children, and tells them stories about their great-grandfather, the Apache Scout, who hunted his own people and lived long enough to see his grandson go to war. William keeps that photograph of Sergeant Rowdy in his living room until he dies. in 1998. James Walker becomes a prominent figure in the civil rights movement in Georgia. He participates in the Montgomery bus boycott, marches in Selma, uses his status as a combat veteran to demand the rights he fought for overseas. He tells anyone who will listen, "I fought Nazis. I can handle Southern racists." He lives to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of He registers to vote for the first time at age 48, bringing his grandson with him to witness the moment. He tells the boy, "I fought for this right. Your children will take it for granted. That's how progress works." Essie Johnson never gets the recognition she deserves during her lifetime. She works as a seamstress, raises 3 children, and participates quietly in civil rights activities. When she dies in 1987, her obituary mentions she was a World War II veteran, but gives no details about her service at Fort Huachuca. Her daughter finds her diary years later and finally understands what her mother had accomplished. The daughter publishes excerpts in a local history journal in 2003, introducing a new generation to the black women who pioneered military service despite facing double discrimination. Fort Huachuca continues operating as an active military installation. Today, it houses the Army Intelligence Center and Network Enterprise Technology Command. The segregation is long gone. Soldiers of all races and both genders serve together. The base that once required separate facilities for black soldiers now operates on principles of equality. Apache Flats has been absorbed into other base facilities. The wickiups are gone. Most people stationed there have no idea about the Apache Scouts who lived and died there. But if you know where to look, you can find traces. The cemetery contains graves of Buffalo soldiers from the frontier days, Apache Scouts from the Indian Wars, and World War II soldiers who trained there. The headstones tell stories of overlapping struggles, of marginalized communities who served despite that marginalization, of warriors who fought multiple wars simultaneously. In 1995, William Chino is invited to speak at Fort Huachuca for a commemoration of the Apache Scouts. He's 75 years old, one of the last living people who knew any of them personally. He stands before an audience of soldiers, historians, and tribal representatives and tells them about his grandfather. He describes Sergeant Rowdy as a man caught between worlds, making impossible choices in impossible times. He talks about Apache Flats, about wickiups erected in defiance of modern houses, about old men maintaining their identity while wearing the uniform of conquest. He describes his own service with the 92nd Division, fighting alongside black soldiers who understood what it meant to prove yourself to people who should never have doubted you. Then he says something that makes many in the audience uncomfortable. My grandfather was not a hero in any simple sense. He hunted his own people. He contributed to the destruction of Apache freedom. Many Apaches considered him a traitor, and they weren't wrong. But he was also a survivor. He made choices that kept his family alive. He served with honor in circumstances that offered no honorable options. The Buffalo soldiers faced similar contradictions. They served a nation that enslaved their ancestors, a nation that denied them basic rights. They fought for freedom while lacking freedom. The women who served in the WWII faced double discrimination, racism, and sexism, yet they persevered. None of these people were perfect heroes. They were human beings doing their best in systems designed to break them. They survived. They served. They passed on what they knew, and slowly, painfully, incompletely, their service changed America. We're standing here today on a desegregated military base in an audience that includes people of all races, because warriors like my grandfather, like the Buffalo Soldiers, like the WWII women, refused to let prejudice define them. They served despite injustice. They proved their worth despite doubters. They fought for a country that didn't fully accept them because they believed their service would make things better for those who came after. They were right, not completely right. We still have work to do, but they were right enough. The audience is silent for a moment after he finishes. Then an elderly black man stands and begins to applaud. It's James Walker, William's friend from Italy, whom William hasn't seen in decades. They embrace these two old warriors while the audience rises to join the applause. After the ceremony, they sit together and talk about things they haven't discussed in 50 years. They talk about Italy, about being pinned down by machine gun fire, about tracking through mountains using skills passed down through generations. They talk about coming home to a country that didn't value their service. They talk about fighting for civil rights, for recognition, for the simple dignity of being treated as equal citizens. Walker says, "Your grandfather and my great-grandfather, they knew each other, you know. I did some research. In 1885, my great-grandfather wrote a letter mentioning an Apache scout named Rowdy, who helped his patrol track hostiles in the Huachuca Mountains. He wrote that this scout was the best tracker he'd ever seen, better than any white soldier or officer. He also wrote that this scout seemed sad in a way that had nothing to do with physical hardship. He wrote, 'This Indian hunts his own people, and the weight of that shows in his eyes.' I understand something of what he feels. We Buffalo Soldiers serve a nation built on enslaving our people. We fight in wars that will never make us equal. We do it because we have no better options. I think the Apache Scouts serve for similar reasons. We are all trapped in systems not of our making, doing the best we can with choices we didn't choose." William feels tears on his face and doesn't wipe them away. My grandfather never talked about the sadness. He taught me skills, told me stories, but he never explained the cost. I only understood it later, after I came back from Italy and realized what it meant to serve a country that considers you second class. But at least I fought enemies who weren't my own people. I can't imagine what he carried. Walker nods. My great-grandfather wrote about that too. He said the Apache Scouts carried the heaviest burden of any soldiers he knew. They fought their own people to ensure survival, knowing that survival meant the death of their traditional way of life. That's a burden no warrior should have to carry. But they carried it anyway. The two old men sit in silence for a while, watching the Arizona sun set over the Huachuca Mountains. The mountains haven't changed. The desert endures. But everything else has transformed in ways that Sergeant Rowdy and the Buffalo Soldiers of the 880s could never have imagined. The Army is desegregated. Black soldiers, Native American soldiers, women soldiers, all serve together as equals. The contradictions aren't gone entirely, but they're diminished. The progress is real, even if incomplete. William finally speaks. Do you think our grandfathers would be proud of what we've become, of what America has become? Walker considers this carefully. I think they'd be glad we survived. I think they'd be glad we're still fighting, still pushing for better. I think they'd recognize that the fight continues, just in different forms. And I think they'd be proud that we haven't forgotten them, that we're telling their stories, that we're acknowledging the complexity of what they've faced. History wants to make heroes and villains. Our grandfathers were neither. They were warriors caught in impossible circumstances, doing what they thought was right or necessary. That's more honest than any simple heroism. As darkness falls over Fort Huachuca, William and James walk through the cemetery together. They find Sergeant Rowdy's grave, weathered but maintained. They find graves of Buffalo soldiers from the '80s with names like Isaiah Dorman, who wrote about sitting in a canyon during a storm with Apache Scouts and realizing they were all warriors without honor in their own lands. The cemetery is quiet, except for the wind moving through the desert grass. This is hallowed ground in ways that have nothing to do with official recognition. This is where warriors rest, men who made impossible choices, who served despite discrimination, who fought multiple wars simultaneously. They rest together now, Apache Scouts and Buffalo soldiers, separated by individual headstones, but united by shared experience. William places his hand on his grandfather's headstone and says in Apache, "I told your story, grandfather. I told them about the complexity, about the contradictions, about the courage it took to survive. I told them you weren't a hero or a traitor, but a warrior, doing what you thought you had to do. I hope that's enough." The wind picks up, and for just a moment, William could swear he hears something in it. Not words exactly, but a presence, an acknowledgement. A warrior recognizing a warrior across the barrier between life and death. James Walker places his hand on his great-grandfather's headstone and says quietly, "You wrote that you and the Apache Scouts understood each other. You were right. We're all still fighting for the same thing, recognition, respect, equality. We've made progress. Your great-great-grandson just graduated from West Point, the first in our family to become an officer. Things you couldn't imagine are now normal, but the fight continues. Thank you for starting it. Thank you for serving despite everything. Thank you for writing your story down so we could understand." They stand there for a while, two old warriors honoring older warriors, the chain of service and sacrifice stretching back through generations. This is what Fort Huachuca represents, not simple heroism, but complex courage. Not uncomplicated service, but persistent dedication despite complications. Not perfect people, but imperfect people doing their best in imperfect systems. For those of you watching who served in the military, who remember the draft, who lived through the civil rights era, who fought in Korea or Vietnam, you understand these contradictions. You lived them. Your fathers and grandfathers lived them. Fort Huachuca represents every time America asked its citizens to be better than the nation itself was willing to be. And time after time, those citizens said yes anyway. The 8 Apache Scouts who lived out their final years at Fort Huachuca were not perfect heroes. They hunted their own people, made compromises many considered betrayals, served an institution that destroyed their traditional way of life. But they also survived when survival required impossible choices. They maintained their identity while wearing the uniform of conquest. They passed down knowledge, culture, and stories that survive to this day. The Buffalo soldiers who served from the frontier days through World War II were not perfect heroes either. Some harbored their own prejudices. Some made mistakes. Some came home bitter. But they also proved that black soldiers could fight as well as any soldiers anywhere. They came home and fought for civil rights, using their veteran status as moral authority to demand equality. They opened doors that took decades to fully open, but they opened them. The women who served in the WWII at Fort Huachuca faced double discrimination, yet persevered. They proved women could handle military responsibilities. They kept operations running. They pioneered roles that women today take for granted. They did it while being paid less, respected less, and acknowledged less. But they did it. These are not stories of perfect people making perfect choices. These are stories of imperfect people doing their best in systems designed to limit them, facing circumstances that offered no good options, and choosing to serve anyway. That's not always heroic in the simple sense. Sometimes it's just survival. But survival is its own kind of victory, especially when that survival slowly transforms into equality. If you're 80 years old today, you were born in 1946, just after World War II ended. You grew up hearing stories about Fort Huachuca, segregation, the Buffalo Soldiers. You lived through the Civil Rights Movement. You watched America slowly, painfully address its contradictions. You've seen real progress. You've also seen how hard-won that progress was. You understand better than anyone that history is not simple, that service is complicated, and that the American story contains both profound injustice and remarkable courage, often simultaneously in the same place, in the same person. Fort Huachuca stands today as a testament to all that complexity. 8 Apache Scouts died there, carrying burdens no warrior should carry. Tens of thousands of black soldiers trained there, proving themselves while facing discrimination. Dozens of black women served there, pioneering military roles. All of them fought 2 wars, one against America's enemies, one for recognition within America. They won both wars, though not completely and not easily. The fight continues in different forms, which is why these stories matter. We need to remember not just victories, but costs. Not just heroes, but impossible choices they faced. Not just progress, but how painfully that progress was achieved. Sergeant Rowdy, dying in 1944 after more than 50 years in uniform, carried knowledge of both Apache resistance and Apache cooperation with conquest. He had no simple answers, only the warrior's code: survive, serve, pass on what you know. Hope the next generation faces better choices. The Buffalo Soldiers came home to continued discrimination, but had gained something that couldn't be taken away: proof of their equality. That knowledge fueled the Civil Rights Movement and transformed America. The WWII women opened doors for every woman in uniform today. They faced discrimination, persevered, and proved their capability. The 8 Apache Scouts are gone. The World War II veterans are nearly all gone. But their story remains, carved into Fort Huachuca's landscape, preserved in military records, remembered by families they deserve remembering, not as perfect heroes, but as complicated people who faced impossible circumstances and chose to serve anyway. That's the truest courage, not absence of doubt, but willingness to serve despite doubt, to fight despite injustice, to hope despite evidence that hope might be foolish. Fort Huachuca stands today in the Arizona desert, its buildings housing new generations who face their own challenges and contradictions. The mountains where Apache Scouts track their own people look the same. The desert endures, The stories endure. The contradictions endure. But so does the courage. So does the service. So does the slowly bending arc of history, pushed forward by warriors who served even when service demanded impossible compromises. This is their story. This is America's story. This is the story of warriors who fought for a country that didn't fully accept them because they believed their service would make things better. They were right. Not completely right, but right enough. And that has made all the difference.